Lena sat on the couch, curled up in a blanket, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock, marking the slow passage of another lonely evening. Mark had called earlier, saying he would be late again. Another work meeting. Another excuse. She sighed, setting her phone aside, trying not to dwell on the growing distance between them. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Mark rushed home just to have dinner with her, when he texted her in the middle of the day just to say he missed her. But now, those days felt like a distant memory, blurred by late nights, unread messages, and a suffocating feeling in her chest that she refused to name. Just as she was about to turn off the lamp and go to bed, her phone buzzed. A message. From an unknown number. If you want to know the truth, be at Maison Rouge. 7 p.m. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to ignore it, probably a prank or a wrong number. But something about the words, about the way they seemed so direct, so intentional, sent a chill through her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Who is this?" she typed. No response. She bit her lip, staring at the message. Maison Rouge. A high-end restaurant in the city. The kind of place where reservations were booked weeks in advance. The kind of place Mark used to take her for anniversaries, before his work became more important than their marriage. Her heart pounded. Something told her that if she went, she wouldn't like what she found. But the alternative, doing nothing, staying in the dark, felt worse. Lena arrived at Maison Rouge a few minutes before 7. The warm glow of chandeliers spilled out through the restaurant's large glass windows, illuminating the elegant couples inside. She hesitated at the entrance, her palms sweating. She could still turn around, go home, pretend she never received the message. But a voice in the back of her mind whispered, "You already know something is wrong." Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The maitre d' greeted her with a polite smile, but Lena didn't linger. Her eyes scanned the room, searching, until they landed on him. Mark, her husband, seated at a candlelit table, laughing, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months. And across from him was a woman. Lena's heart clenched. The woman was beautiful, with wavy brown hair and a radiant smile, leaning slightly toward Mark as he spoke. The way she looked at him, soft, expectant, made bile rise in Lena's throat. Then, Mark reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind the woman's ear. The gesture was small, intimate, the kind of thing he used to do to her. Lena felt the ground tilt beneath her. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in time, unable to move, unable to breathe. The restaurant around her blurred. The clinking of glasses, the murmurs of conversation, the soft hum of violin music, all faded into the background. She wanted to march up to their table, demand an explanation, scream, cry, anything. But she couldn't move. Then her phone buzzed. She blinked, dragging her gaze away from Mark to the screen. "I'm sorry you had to see this, Lena. You deserve better." A fresh wave of shock crashed over her. Her hands trembled as she typed back. "Who are you?" A few seconds passed. Then the reply came. "Someone who cares about you more than he ever did." Lena's breath hitched. That sentence, it wasn't from a stranger. It wasn't random. It was careful, deliberate, familiar. And suddenly she knew. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she read the number again. It was Ethan, her best friend. The realization hit her harder than Mark's betrayal. Lena's fingers tightened around her phone as she reread the message. Someone who cares about you more than he ever did. Ethan, her best friend. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her mind struggling to process everything at once. Mark, her husband, was here, on a date with another woman, smiling at her in a way he hadn't smiled at Lena in months. And Ethan, the person who had always been there for her, through every high and low, had been the one to show her the truth.
Why?
Why hadn't he just told her? Why send an anonymous message and let her walk into this nightmare? Lena's legs felt unsteady, her stomach twisting painfully as she stood there, rooted to the spot. She wanted to leave, to run away from this suffocating scene, but at the same time, she couldn't move. And then, as if sensing something, Mark glanced toward the entrance. Their eyes met. For a split second, his smile faltered, his body going rigid. Lena saw it then, the flicker of panic in his gaze, the way his fingers tensed around his wine glass. But it was brief, gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully controlled expression. He leaned back, forcing a smile, as if nothing were wrong, as if she weren't standing there, watching him betray her. A bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat. So this was it? No guilt? No remorse? Just casual indifference? Lena's fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She turned sharply, pushing past the entrance before the dam of emotions inside her could break. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it wasn't enough to soothe the fire raging in her chest. Her phone buzzed again. Lena, talk to me. Her vision blurred as she typed back furiously. Where are you? A pause. Then, turn around. Lena's breath caught as she turned, her heart pounding. Across the street, leaning against a black sedan, stood Ethan. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable, but the way he was watching her, his deep brown eyes filled with something raw, something almost painful, told her everything. He had known. He had known about Mark's affair, and he had been the one to break her heart open with the truth. Lena crossed the street in hurried steps, the cold pavement biting through the thin heels of her shoes. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. She just stared, searching his face for answers. Ethan let out a slow breath. I'm sorry. His voice was quiet, steady, but there was something else beneath it. Lena swallowed hard. How long have you known? A muscle in his jaw ticked. A few months. A fresh wave of hurt crashed over her. Months. He had known for months, and he hadn't told her. She took a shaky step back. Why didn't you say anything? Ethan's gaze darkened. Because I knew you wouldn't believe me. Lena's breath hitched. And damn it, he was right. She wouldn't have believed him. If Ethan had told her outright that Mark was cheating, she would have made excuses, told herself he was mistaken. Because despite all the late nights, all the cold distance, all the signs, she had wanted to believe in her marriage. I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan continued, his voice rough. But I couldn't just watch you waste your love on someone who doesn't deserve it. Lena felt something in her chest crack. He had been watching, waiting, holding on to this truth, knowing it would shatter her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath unsteady. Why did you send the message? Ethan hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, quietly, because I care about you, Lena. More than he ever did. Her heart stuttered. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, she saw it. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her. The way his shoulders tensed, like he was holding himself back from reaching for her. The quiet, steady presence he had always been in her life. She had been blind. Completely, utterly blind. Her lip trembled. Ethan? But before she could say another word, his phone rang. He sighed, glancing at the screen. It's work. Lena barely nodded, still trying to process the weight of everything. He hesitated, then looked at her again. Go home, okay? Don't, his jaw clenched. Don't let him talk his way out of this. She gave him a hollow smile. I won't. Ethan exhaled, reluctant, before finally answering the call and turning away. Lena stood there, staring after him, her heart tangled in a storm of emotions. She had come here, expecting the truth. But she hadn't expected this. Now she had a choice to make. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure what to do. Lena stood on the sidewalk long after Ethan left, the cold night air biting at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, tangled between the pain of betrayal and the realization that the one person who had always been there for her had feelings she had never noticed. She should go home. She should lock the door, drown herself in a warm bath, and pretend tonight never happened. But she knew herself too well. If she left now, if she didn't confront Mark, he would twist the truth, manipulate her, make her doubt what she had seen with her own eyes. So instead, She turned back toward the restaurant. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pushed through the doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She ignored the maitre d's confused look, her gaze locked onto one table. Mark was still there, still smiling at that woman. Lena felt the rage rise in her chest like a fire, burning through the pain, the heartbreak, the numbness. She walked straight to the table, stopping just beside them. Mark turned, his smile slipping when he saw her. Lena. She slapped his phone onto the table. The screen was still lit up from the last message Ethan had sent. Mark's face paled. The woman across from him, probably still oblivious to who Lena was, blinked in confusion. Mark? Who is she? Lena let out a bitter laugh. She doesn't even know he's married. Classic. Mark recovered quickly, shifting in his seat. Lena, let's talk outside. Why? She asked, tilting her head. Are you afraid she'll find out the truth? The woman frowned. What truth? Lena turned to her. That he's married. The color drained from the woman's face, and she immediately looked at Mark. Is this true? Mark sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose like he was the one dealing with an inconvenience. Lena, can we not do this here? Lena's stomach churned. The way he said it, so calm, so unaffected, it made her sick. She had loved him, given him her heart, her time, years of her life. And he acted like she was the problem. Do you even feel guilty? She asked, voice trembling. Or did you just assume I'd never find out? Mark's jaw tightened. This isn't what you think. Save it. Lena clenched her fists. You don't get to lie anymore. People were starting to stare. Conversations had quieted, subtle whispers rippling through the restaurant. Mark's gaze flickered around the room, then back to her. His voice dropped lower. We should talk about this at home. Lena let out a hollow laugh. There's nothing to talk about. I came here to see the truth for myself. The woman across from him stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. I'm not doing this, she muttered, before turning on her heel and walking out. Lena almost pitted her. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. Lena, don't make a scene. She stared at him, at the man she had once thought she would spend forever with, and felt nothing. No more love. No more hope. Just exhaustion. I don't have to, she said quietly, because we're done. Then, without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away. And this time, she didn't look back. By the time Lena reached her apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only an ache in her chest. She kicked off her heels, dropping her purse on the counter, and sank onto the couch. It was over. Her marriage. The life she thought she had. She should feel devastated. She should be sobbing, breaking apart, unable to breathe. But instead, she just felt free. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Ethan, are you okay? She hesitated, then typed back. Lena, not yet. But I will be. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed again. Ethan, I'm here if you need me. Lena stared at the message, something warm spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. The days that followed were a blur. Lena moved through them on autopilot, packing her things, calling a lawyer, cutting Mark out of her life piece by piece. He had tried to reach out at first, sending messages, showing up at their apartment, but she ignored him. There was nothing left to say. And through it all, Ethan was there. Not pushing. Not demanding. Just there. Whether it was a quiet text in the morning or showing up with takeout when she forgot to eat, he made sure she never had to face anything alone. But what unsettled her most wasn't Mark's betrayal. It was the way her heart reacted whenever Ethan was near. The way she caught herself looking at him longer than before. The way her chest tightened at the concern in his eyes. She had never thought about him like that, had never allowed herself to. He was her best friend, her anchor, the one person she could always count on. She couldn't lose that. She wouldn't. And yet, one evening, as she sat curled up on her couch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, she found herself staring at her phone. At their messages. At all the times he had been there, even when she had never noticed. A quiet knock on the door made her jump. She set her cup down and pulled the door open. Ethan stood there, dressed in a simple black sweater and jeans, a bag of food in his hand. His familiar, steady presence instantly eased the tightness in her chest. "You didn't answer my text," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, because he never needed one. Lena sighed. "I was just thinking." Ethan set the food down and turned to face her fully. "About what?" Lena hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself. "Everything," she admitted. "Mark. The past. You." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Me?" She swallowed. "You've always been there for me." His jaw tightened. "Of course I have." She exhaled, her chest aching. "I never saw it, did I?" Ethan's eyes darkened, but he didn't say anything. Lena took a step forward, her heart hammering. "Why didn't you tell me?" A humorless chuckle left his lips. "And say what, Lena? That I've been in love with you for years? That I had to watch you marry someone who didn't deserve you?" Her breath hitched. "Ethan?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "I didn't tell you, because it wouldn't have mattered. You loved him." "I thought I loved him," she whispered. "But he never made me feel the way you do." Silence. A charged, heavy silence that wrapped around them like a storm waiting to break. Then Ethan exhaled sharply and closed the distance between them in one step. His hands cupped her face, his touch both hesitant and desperate, like he had waited too long for this moment. "Lena," he murmured, "tell me to stop." She didn't. Instead, she leaned in, her lips brushing his, soft, tentative, filled with every unspoken feeling between them. And just like that, everything changed. The kiss was soft, hesitant, but it shattered everything Lena thought she knew. Ethan had always been her safe place, her anchor. She had never imagined what it would feel like to be kissed by him, to feel the warmth of his hands on her skin, the steady rhythm of his heart against hers. But now that she had, there was no going back. When they finally pulled away, her breath was unsteady, her thoughts tangled in a mess of emotions she wasn't ready to name. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me this isn't a mistake." Lena swallowed hard. "I don't know what this is yet," she admitted. "But I know it's not a mistake." A slow, relieved breath escaped him. His thumb brushed over her cheek, lingering like he was memorizing the moment. "Then we'll figure it out together." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was new. This was terrifying. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Falling into something with Ethan wasn't like falling in love for the first time. It was like finding something she had lost without realizing it was missing. At first, they were careful. Ethan gave her space, never pushing, never expecting too much. He still showed up with takeout, still sent her good morning texts, still listened when she needed to talk. The only difference was the way his touch lingered, how his fingers brushed against hers when he handed her a cup of coffee, how his knee pressed against hers when they sat side by side. The first time he reached for her hand in public, Lena froze. Ethan noticed immediately. He didn't say anything, just gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before letting go. And somehow, that small act of patience made her chest ache more than any grand gesture ever could. 2 months passed in quiet moments, in slow, careful steps toward something more. And then one night, everything changed. Lena wasn't sure what woke her. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. Then she heard it, her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, she reached for it, squinting at the screen. Mark. Her stomach clenched. She hesitated, then declined the call. A second later, a message popped up. "Mark, I need to see you." Lena stared at the screen, her chest tightening. For months, she had ignored him. She had moved on, rebuilt her life, let herself start to feel something real for Ethan. So, why did this one message shake her so much? She didn't realize she was gripping her phone too tightly until a warm hand covered hers. Ethan. He was sitting up beside her, his brows drawn together in concern. "What's wrong?" Lena swallowed. It's Mark. Ethan's expression darkened. What does he want? She hesitated. I don't know. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Are you going to see him? She looked at him then, really looked at him. At the quiet strength in his eyes. At the patience he had given her, the space, the time. At the way he was trying so hard not to tell her what to do, even though she knew the thought of her meeting Mark made him furious. And in that moment, Lena realized something. Mark was her past. Ethan was her future. She exhaled slowly and put her phone face down on the nightstand. No, she said firmly. I don't need to. Ethan didn't say anything at first. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. Good, he murmured, pulling her into his arms. Because I don't want to lose you. Lena relaxed against him, her heart steady for the first time in a long time. You won't, she whispered. And for the first time, she knew it was true. Lena didn't expect to fall for Ethan so fast. She had told herself it would take time, that she needed space to heal, to understand what she truly wanted. But love didn't wait for permission. It happened in the little things, like the way Ethan's fingers brushed against hers when they walked side by side, the way he always ordered her favorite drink without asking, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long when he thought she wasn't looking. And yet, neither of them spoke the words out loud. Not yet. Maybe because they both knew that once they did, there would be no turning back. It was past midnight when Lena heard a knock on her door. She frowned, pulling her robe tighter around her as she padded across the living room. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable. Ethan? She blinked. What are you doing here? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Lena frowned. Did something happen? He shook his head, then hesitated. I needed to see you. Her heart skipped a beat. For a long moment, they just stood there, the quiet hum of the city behind them. Then, finally, Lena stepped aside. Come in. Ethan hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. She didn't ask any more questions. She just sat beside him on the couch, close enough for their shoulders to brush, and waited. And when Ethan finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper, her heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. I'm scared, he admitted. Lena turned to face him fully. Of what? He exhaled slowly. Of losing you. Something tightened in her chest. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. You won't. Ethan let out a soft breath, like he wanted to believe her. And in that moment, Lena made a silent promise. She wouldn't let fear get in the way of what they had. Not this time. They were at a bookstore when it happened. Lena was running her fingers along the spines of old novels, lost in thought, when Ethan suddenly called her name. She turned to find him watching her, something unreadable in his gaze. What is it? She asked, tilting her head. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, it looked like he was about to say something important, something that would change everything. But then he hesitated, exhaling softly. Nothing, he murmured. It's nothing. Lena frowned. Ethan. Come on, he cut her off with a small smile. Let's go get coffee. She let it go. But later that night, as she lay in bed replaying the moment over and over, she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been about to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Or maybe something she was waiting for. Ethan had been acting strange. Lena didn't know when she started noticing it, maybe after that moment in the bookstore. Or maybe it had been building for weeks, lingering between them in every unspoken word, every lingering glance. But now it was impossible to ignore. He would start to say something, only to stop himself. His fingers would twitch like he wanted to reach for her, but he never did. It was driving her crazy. So, when she found herself sitting across from him at a small café on a rainy afternoon, watching him stir his coffee absently, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Ethan, she said, setting her cup down. What's going on with you? He blinked, looking up. What? She gave him a look. Don't what me. You've been weird lately. Distracted. Like you want to say something but won't. Ethan opened his mouth, then hesitated. Lena sighed, leaning forward. Just say it. He exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around his cup. Lena, her heart pounded. Here it was. He was finally going to say it. Before he could finish, someone called her name. Lena turned, startled, and felt her stomach drop.
Mark.
He stood a few feet away, looking like he had just stepped out of a storm. His hair was damp, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and his expression unreadable. For a second, she could only stare. Then she felt Ethan stiffen beside her. Her fingers clenched around her cup. Mark, what are you doing here? He ignored the question, his gaze flickering between her and Ethan before settling back on her. I need to talk to you. Ethan's jaw tensed. She doesn't owe you anything. Mark's eyes darkened. This isn't your business. Ethan let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Oh, now you care about boundaries? Lena's heart pounded as the tension between them crackled like electricity. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Not now. Not when she was finally starting to understand what she wanted. Mark looked back at her, his voice softer. Lena, please. Ethan inhaled sharply beside her. This was it. A choice. One she should have made long ago. Lena exhaled, her fingers tightening around her napkin. Then slowly she turned to Ethan. And without hesitation, she reached for his hand. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes flickering to their joined hands before settling on hers. Mark's expression faltered. Lena met his gaze, her voice steady. There's nothing left to talk about. For a moment, Mark looked like he wanted to argue. But then he saw something in her expression, something that made his shoulders sag slightly. He nodded once, his jaw tightening. Okay, he murmured. And just like that, he turned and walked away. Lena exhaled, the weight on her chest finally lifting. She looked back at Ethan, her fingers still tangled with his. Ethan swallowed, his voice rough. Lena, she took a deep breath. No more unfinished words, she whispered. No more hesitation. His fingers tightened around hers. Then let me say it, he murmured. Let me say what I should have told you a long time ago. Lena's heart pounded. And then, finally, he said the words she had been waiting for. I love you. A shaky breath left her lips. And as she looked at the man who had always been there, the man who had chosen her every single time, she knew. I love you too. Lena didn't realize how light she would feel once she finally said the words. For so long, she had hesitated, afraid of stepping into something new, afraid of making the wrong choice. But standing here, holding Ethan's hand, looking into his eyes filled with so much warmth and quiet devotion, she knew there had never really been a choice at all. It had always been him. Ethan exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for years. His lips curved into a small, disbelieving smile. Say it again. Lena laughed softly. I love you. His fingers tightened around hers, pulling her in. One more time. She shook her head, her heart pounding as she rose on her toes, her hands resting against his chest. You're ridiculous. But Ethan only grinned before closing the distance between them. The kiss was different this time. Not hesitant, not cautious. This was a promise, a declaration. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan pressed his forehead against hers. I don't care how long it took us to get here, he murmured. As long as we stay. Lena exhaled, a warmth spreading through her chest. No more hesitation. No more unfinished words. She was exactly where she was meant to be, with him. And this time, she wasn't letting go.